How much trust do you place in a simple knock at the door? On Halloween night, that trust is part of the tradition. We open our homes to masked strangers, offering treats in a playful ritual. But what happens when the mask isn't just a costume, and the paper bag held out for candy conceals not a sweet tooth, but an instrument of cold, calculated death? This is the core of a true, nightmarish story from 1957, a case that proves that the most terrifying monsters are the ones that look just like us. The evening of October 31st, 1957, settled over the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles like a Rockwell painting come to life. In their cozy suburban home, 38-year-old barber Peter Fabiano and his wife, Betty, were preparing for the waves of trick-or-treaters. Peter was a well-liked man, a friendly face in the community. As darkness fell, the familiar rhythm of the holiday began. The doorbell ringing, the excited shouts of children, the rustle of candy wrappers. It was a scene of idyllic, all-American innocence. A scene poised on the edge of an unthinkable horror. At approximately 7:45 p.m., the doorbell chimed once more. Betty was in the bedroom, so Peter went to answer it. Through the door, he saw a figure, difficult to discern in the porch light. It was holding a paper bag, the kind a child might carry for their Halloween loot. Peter opened the door, likely with a smile on his face, ready to drop another piece of candy into the bag. It was the last act of kindness he would ever perform. The figure at the door said nothing, or perhaps whispered the traditional greeting, before the night was shattered by a single, deafening gunshot. Betty heard the explosive crack from the bedroom and rushed into the living room to a scene of pure chaos and disbelief. Peter was crumpled on the floor, a fatal wound to his chest. The figure at the door was gone, vanished into the sea of other costumed revelers roaming the neighborhood. The only thing left behind was the paper bag, which lay discarded near the doorway. Inside was not a collection of candy, but the murder weapon itself, a .38 caliber pistol, still warm from its deadly purpose. A festive tradition had been twisted into a grotesque and surreal murder scene. The Los Angeles Police Department arrived to a neighborhood buzzing with festive energy, a stark and macabre contrast to the silent tragedy inside the Fabiano home. The central challenge of the investigation was immediately, terrifyingly clear. The killer had chosen the one night of the year when their disguise was not a disguise at all, but simply part of the scenery. They had used the innocence of Halloween as the ultimate cloak, allowing them to approach their victim without suspicion and escape into a crowd of phantoms, ghouls, and cowboys. Lead detectives began the painstaking work of piecing together the final moments of Peter Fabiano's life. They interviewed a distraught Betty, who, as a grieving widow, became their primary source of information. She could offer no explanation, no reason why anyone would want to harm her husband. she painted a picture of a happy marriage and a man without enemies. The police were faced with a seemingly motiveless crime, the most difficult kind to solve. The killer was a ghost, and their motive was a complete and utter void. Investigators delved into Peter's background, searching for any hidden conflict or secret that could lead to such a violent end. They spoke to his friends, his customers at the barbershop, and his acquaintances. The story was always the same. Peter Fabiano was a good man, a hardworking, ordinary citizen with no known ties to criminal activity or any simmering personal feuds. The deeper they dug into his life, the more baffling the murder became. He was the least likely of victims, which only made the crime feel more random and terrifying. The physical evidence was frustratingly scarce. The gun left in the bag offered a potential lead, but tracing its ownership in the 1950s was a monumental task. The paper bag was a common grocery sack, devoid of any unique markings. There were no reliable witnesses. Children in the neighborhood had seen countless figures in costumes, but no one could recall anything specific or out of the ordinary about the person who approached the Fabiano's door. The killer had executed their plan with chilling precision and had simply melted back into the night. As the initial days of the investigation passed with no clear suspects, the press seized upon the bizarre nature of the crime. Headlines screamed about the trick-or-treat murder, and a palpable wave of fear washed over the suburbs of Los Angeles. The story tapped into a primal fear: the violation of the home, the twisting of a beloved children's holiday into a blood sport. The case was no longer just a homicide. It was a modern-day horror story that had parents locking their doors and viewing every approaching trick-or-treater with a new, unsettling suspicion. The detectives, feeling the immense public pressure, began to focus more intently on the person closest to the victim. His wife, Betty, while her grief seemed genuine on the surface, experienced investigators are trained to look for the subtle cracks in a facade. They started to scrutinize her statements, comparing them, rereading them, searching for any inconsistencies. They began to wonder if the key to the mystery was not an external enemy of Peter's, but a secret held within the four walls of the Fabiano home itself. Their suspicion led them to look into Betty's social circle. It was there they found a name that would change the entire trajectory of the investigation: Joan Rabel. Joan was Betty's closest friend, a constant companion. Their bond was described by others as unusually intense. As detectives began to discreetly observe the two women, they noticed a dynamic that seemed to go beyond simple friendship. The grieving widow and her supportive friend appeared to be partners, their lives deeply and intimately intertwined in a way that raised immediate red flags. The theory that began to form was as old as crime itself: a deadly love triangle. The detectives hypothesized that Betty Fabiano and Joan Rabel were more than just friends. They were lovers. Peter, in this scenario, was not the target of some random phantom, but an obstacle, the one person standing in the way of their life together. The motive, which had been a complete blank, suddenly sharpened into a crystal-clear picture of jealousy, passion, and murderous conspiracy. But it was still just a theory, a story without proof. The investigation shifted from a hunt for a masked stranger to a careful, psychological game of observation. Detectives placed Betty and Joan under surveillance, documenting their meetings, their conversations, their every move. They wanted to see if the women would make a mistake, if the immense pressure of their secret would cause one of them to crack. The weight of a hidden murder is a heavy burden to carry, and the detectives were betting that it was only a matter of time before that burden became too much to bear. The pressure campaign worked. After weeks of intense scrutiny, detectives brought Betty Fabiano in for another round of questioning. This time, the tone was different. They were no longer speaking to a grieving widow, but to a primary suspect. They presented her with their theory, laying out the evidence of her relationship with Joan. They watched as her composure began to crumble, as the facade she had so carefully maintained began to disintegrate under the harsh lights of the interrogation room. The moment of truth was at hand, and then it happened. Betty Fabiano confessed. The dam of lies broke, and the entire sordid story came pouring out in a torrent of tears and admissions. She admitted to her love affair with Joan Rabel. She admitted that they both saw Peter as an obstacle to their happiness. She admitted that they had conspired together to have him removed permanently. But then she delivered a final, shocking twist that the investigators were not prepared for. Neither she nor Joan had pulled the trigger. They had manipulated someone else into becoming their assassin. The name Betty gave them was Goldyne Pizer, a friend of Joan Rabel's. The story of Goldyne's involvement was a chilling masterclass in psychological manipulation. Betty and Joan had spent months poisoning Goldyne's mind with a web of intricate lies. They convinced her that Peter Fabiano was not a friendly barber, but a dangerous, evil man. They told her that Peter had discovered their affair and was ruthlessly blackmailing Joan, threatening to ruin her life unless his demands were met. They painted Peter as a villain, a monster who needed to be stopped. They told Goldyne that the only way to save Joan from this terrible torment was to frighten him. Their plan, as they presented it to the gullible Goldyne, was simple. She was to go to the Fabiano house on Halloween night, knock on the door, and scare Peter. To help her with this task, they gave her a gun and a paper bag, but they assured her of one crucial and diabolical detail. The gun was loaded only with blanks. Goldyne Pizer, completely convinced that she was on a righteous mission to save her friend from a blackmailer, agreed to the plan. She believed she was merely the star of a dramatic prank. She had no idea that Betty and Joan had given her a gun loaded with a very real, very deadly bullet. She was a pawn in their twisted game, a puppet whose strings were being pulled by two master manipulators. She was the perfect assassin because she didn't even know she was one. Armed with Betty's detailed confession, the police moved swiftly. Joan Rabel and Goldyne Pizer were arrested. The public was stunned by the revelation. The trick-or-treat killer was not a monstrous man or a thrill-seeking youth, but a 42-year-old woman who had been cruelly deceived into becoming a murderer. The case had transformed from a chilling mystery into a sordid tale of suburban passion, betrayal, and a level of cold-hearted manipulation that was difficult to comprehend. The ensuing trial was a media sensation, gripping the nation. The three women, once bound by their dark secret, were now pitted against each other in a desperate fight for their own survival. The prosecution laid out the conspiracy in meticulous detail, using Betty's confession and corroborating evidence to paint a damning picture of Joan Rabel as the cold, calculating mastermind who orchestrated the entire plot, and Betty as her willing, love-struck accomplice. Goldyne Pizer's defense was unique and tragic. Her lawyers argued that she was, in a sense, a victim herself. She was a woman of limited intelligence who had been brainwashed by two more sophisticated and ruthless individuals. They presented evidence of her gullible nature and the intense psychological pressure Joan and Betty had exerted upon her. She was portrayed as a dupe, a tool that was used to commit a murder, and then intended to be discarded. The jury was faced with a complex web of guilt and responsibility. They had to decide the fate of the two lovers who had planned the murder and the woman they had tricked into carrying it out. After days of deliberation, they returned with their verdicts. Betty Fabiano and Joan Rabel were found guilty of first-degree murder. Their love had led them not to a new life together, but to a shared future behind the cold, hard bars of a prison cell. For Goldyne Pizer, the verdict was different. The jury, swayed by the evidence of her manipulation, found her guilty of a lesser charge, voluntary manslaughter. They acknowledged that while she had pulled the trigger, her moral culpability was diminished by the elaborate and cruel deception she had been subjected to. She had committed the act, but the intent, the malice, had been born in the minds of the other two women. Betty Fabiano and Joan Rabel were sentenced to life in prison. Goldyne Pizer received a sentence of 5 years to life and was ultimately paroled after serving a fraction of that time. Justice, in its own complex and imperfect way, had been served. The sensational trial came to an end, but the story of the trick-or-treat murder was permanently etched into the annals of American true crime lore. A chilling example of how domestic passion can curdle into deadly conspiracy. The legacy of the Peter Fabiano case is not just about the bizarre method of the murder, but about the terrifying power of psychological manipulation. It serves as a dark case study in how a person's reality can be warped, how their sense of right and wrong can be twisted by those they trust. Joan and Betty did not just load a gun with a bullet. They loaded Goldyne Pizer's mind with a lie, turning her into a weapon as surely as the pistol she carried. The crime also shattered the carefully constructed facade of 1950s suburban tranquility. It revealed that behind the manicured lawns and cheerful greetings of post-war America, the same dark passions of jealousy, betrayal, and murder could fester. The Fabiano home was not a castle breached by an outside evil, but a house that was poisoned from within. The monster wasn't at the door. It was already inside, waiting for its moment. The image of the paper bag, an object of such mundane innocence, became a symbol of the case's chilling duality. On the outside, it represented a childish and harmless tradition. On the inside, it concealed a deadly secret. This perfectly mirrored the conspirators themselves. On the surface, they were ordinary suburban women, a wife, a friend. But within them lay a capacity for cold-blooded, murderous plotting that was truly monstrous. The case forces us to reconsider the nature of guilt. Who was the true killer of Peter Fabiano? Was it the woman who held the gun, believing it to be a toy? Or was it the two women who, with malice and forethought, placed that gun in her hand and sent her on her deadly errand? The law provided its answer, but the moral question remains a subject of debate and a source of the case's enduring, unsettling power. Ultimately, the story of Peter Fabiano's death is a cautionary tale about the darkness that can hide behind a friendly face, whether it's the smiling mask of a trick-or-treater or the loving facade of a spouse. It reminds us that the most dangerous threats often don't announce themselves with a roar, but with a simple, quiet knock at the door, carrying their evil intentions in the most disarming of disguises. And so, the fateful knock on that Halloween night in 1957 echoes through history, not as a simple whodunit, but as a complex and disturbing exploration of human darkness. It's a story that proves the most terrifying conspiracies are not hatched in shadowy back alleys by hardened criminals, but sometimes in quiet living rooms by the very people we are supposed to trust the most.